What would you do if you had just 9 seconds to prove that everything everyone believed about you was wrong? 9 seconds to show that the quiet kid everyone overlooked actually possessed something extraordinary. 9 seconds that would make hardened Navy SEALs stop dead in their tracks and question everything they thought they knew about human potential. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a name you've probably never heard, but a person whose 9 seconds of pure determination changed not just his own life, but the lives of some of the most elite warriors in the world. It's a story about the power of the human spirit when pushed beyond what seems possible, and how sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. But before we get to those 9 seconds that defied belief, we need to understand who Marcus really was and why nobody saw it coming. Marcus Chen had always been invisible. Not literally, of course, but in every way that seemed to matter in his small town of Millfield, Oregon. At 22 years old, he stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed no more than 140 pounds, soaking wet, and had the kind of quiet demeanor that made people forget he was in the room within minutes of meeting him. His father, David Chen, owned the only Chinese restaurant in town, a modest establishment called Golden Dragon that served decent food to locals who thought orange chicken was the height of authentic cuisine. His mother, Linda, worked as a seamstress at the local dry cleaner, her fingers nimble from years of detailed work, her English still carrying the soft accent of her native Taiwan despite living in America for over 30 years. Marcus had grown up helping in the restaurant after school, washing dishes, taking orders, and listening to the casual racism that small-town customers sometimes felt comfortable expressing when they thought he couldn't understand their jokes. He understood every word, of course. He'd been born in Oregon, spoke perfect English, and had graduated valedictorian from Millfield High School with a 4.0 GPA and a full scholarship to Oregon State University. But none of that seemed to matter when people looked at him. They saw a quiet Asian kid who probably knew kung fu movies but couldn't defend himself in a real fight. They saw someone who was smart with books but weak in every way that counted in their minds. They saw exactly what Marcus had learned to show them. Nothing threatening, nothing remarkable, nothing that would draw unwanted attention. What they didn't see was the hours Marcus spent every morning at 4 a.m. running through the hills outside town in complete darkness. They didn't see the makeshift gym he built in the restaurant's basement, using concrete blocks and steel pipes to create weights that he lifted in silence while his parents slept upstairs. They didn't see the military books he devoured, the survival manuals he memorized, or the tactical training videos he studied with the intensity of a scholar preparing for the most important exam of his life. Because Marcus Chen had a secret dream that he'd never shared with anyone, not even his parents. He wanted to be a Navy SEAL. It wasn't a dream that made sense to anyone who knew him. SEALs were supposed to be massive, intimidating warriors who looked like they could bench press a truck. They were supposed to come from military families or have backgrounds in football or wrestling. They were supposed to be everything that Marcus wasn't: obvious, confident, and physically imposing. But Marcus had done his research. He knew that while physical strength was important, mental toughness was everything. He knew that some of the most successful SEALs weren't the biggest guys in the room, but the ones who simply refused to quit when everyone else gave up. He knew that the training was designed to break people mentally before it broke them physically, and he'd spent years preparing his mind for exactly that kind of challenge. The decision to actually pursue his dream came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when Marcus was working the lunch shift at Golden Dragon. A group of college students from Oregon State had come in, clearly drunk despite it being barely past noon, and they were being loud and obnoxious in the way that young men often are when they think they're being funny. "Hey, Bruce Lee," one of them called out to Marcus as he delivered their order. "You know any of that karate stuff? Can you chop some boards for us?" His friends laughed, and Marcus felt the familiar flush of embarrassment and anger that he'd learned to suppress years ago. He smiled politely, set down their food, and started to walk away. "Ah, come on," another one continued. "Don't be shy. I bet you're secretly a ninja or something. Isn't that what all you people do?" Marcus stopped walking. For a moment, he considered responding the way he always did, with silence, with acceptance, with the quiet dignity his parents had taught him was the best way to handle ignorance. But something inside him snapped that day, not into anger, but into clarity. He turned around and looked directly at the student who had spoken. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady, "I'm going to be a Navy SEAL." The entire restaurant went quiet. The college students stared at him for a moment, then burst into laughter so loud that other customers turned to look. The one who'd called him Bruce Lee nearly spit out his drink. "You?" he gasped between laughs. "A SEAL? Dude, you weigh like 90 pounds. They'd use you as a flotation device." More laughter. Marcus felt his cheeks burn, but he didn't back down. "We'll see," he said simply, and walked back to the kitchen. His father looked up from the wok where he was stir-frying vegetables. "What was that about, son?" "I'm going to enlist, Dad," Marcus said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "I'm going to try out for the SEALs." David Chen set down his spatula and looked at his son for a long moment. Marcus expected the same reaction he'd gotten from the college students: doubt, laughter, concern about his size and apparent unsuitability for military service. Instead, his father nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was a soldier in Taiwan," David said quietly, "before we came to America. He was a small man too, but he was the toughest person I ever knew. If this is what you want to do, your mother and I will support you." That conversation happened on a Tuesday. By Friday, Marcus was at the Navy recruitment office in Portland, taking his ASVAB test and beginning the process that would eventually lead him to basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, known to those who survived it simply as BUD/S. The recruiter, a grizzled chief petty officer named Rodriguez, looked Marcus up and down with barely concealed skepticism when he explained his goals. "Son," Rodriguez said, leaning back in his chair, "I'm not going to lie to you. You don't look like SEAL material. You're small, you're quiet, and you've got no military background. The failure rate for BUD/S is over 80%, and most of the guys who wash out are bigger and stronger than you." "I understand, Chief," Marcus replied, "but I'd like to try anyway." Rodriguez studied him for a moment longer. "Tell me why you want this. And don't give me some speech about serving your country or proving yourself. I want the real reason." Marcus thought about the college students laughing at him. He thought about all the times people had looked right through him or made assumptions about who he was based on how he looked. He thought about his secret training sessions and his dreams of doing something that mattered, something that would prove to himself and everyone else that he was more than what they saw on the surface. "Because I need to know if I'm as strong as I think I am," Marcus said finally. "And because I think I have something to offer, even if it's not obvious." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "That's honest, at least." "All right, Chen, let's see what you're made of. But understand this, once you sign these papers, there's no going back. The Navy doesn't care about your feelings or your dreams. They're going to try to break you in ways you can't even imagine yet. And if you're not ready for that, you're going to wash out like most everyone else." Marcus signed the papers without hesitation. The next 8 months were a blur of preparation. Marcus completed basic training at Great Lakes Naval Station, where his quiet competence and refusal to draw attention to himself served him well. He wasn't the strongest recruit or the fastest, but he was consistent, reliable, and utterly determined. His drill instructors noticed that while other recruits complained about the difficulty or tried to find shortcuts, Marcus simply put his head down and did whatever was required, no matter how unpleasant. After basic training came more specialized schools and preparation for BUD/S. Marcus spent every free moment studying, training, and mentally preparing himself for what he knew would be the most challenging experience of his life. He called his parents every week, and they always asked the same question: was he sure this was what he wanted? The answer was always yes, even when Marcus wasn't entirely sure himself. There were moments, usually late at night, when he was alone with his thoughts, when he wondered if everyone who doubted him was right. Maybe he was too small, too quiet, too different from the stereotypical image of what a SEAL should be. Maybe his dream was just that, a dream with no basis in reality. But then he would remember those 9 seconds of laughter in his family's restaurant, and his resolve would harden again. He was going to prove them wrong, or he was going to fail trying. Either way, he would know for certain what he was capable of. The call came on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Marcus was to report to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in San Diego, California for basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, Class 247. He had 2 weeks to get his affairs in order and report for duty. His parents drove him to the airport in Portland, and for the first time in his life, Marcus saw his father cry. Not sobbing, not dramatic, just quiet tears rolling down his cheeks as he hugged his son goodbye. "Make us proud," his mother whispered in his ear. But more importantly, make yourself proud. The flight to San Diego was turbulent, which Marcus took as an omen of what was to come. As the plane descended through the clouds and he saw the sprawling military installation below, he felt a mixture of excitement and terror that made his stomach clench. In less than 48 hours, he would be standing on the beach at Coronado with roughly 180 other men, all of whom shared his dream of becoming a Navy SEAL. By the time training was over, statistics suggested that fewer than 30 of them would remain. The rest would have quit, been injured, or been deemed unsuitable for the program. Marcus stared out the airplane window at the Pacific Ocean, stretching endlessly toward the horizon, and made himself a promise. He might not be the biggest, strongest, or most obviously qualified candidate in his class. He might not look like what people expected a SEAL to look like. But he would not quit, no matter what they threw at him, no matter how much pain they inflicted, no matter how many times they told him he didn't belong, he would not quit. He had no idea that in just a few weeks he would face a moment that would test that promise in ways he couldn't imagine, and that those 9 seconds of pure determination would change everything not just for him, but for some of the most elite warriors in the world. As the plane touched down at San Diego International Airport, Marcus Chen took a deep breath and stepped into the unknown, carrying nothing but a duffel bag, an unshakable determination, and a secret that even he didn't fully understand yet. The journey to those legendary 9 seconds had officially begun. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado looked exactly like what Marcus had imagined hell might look like, if hell had palm trees and a perfect view of the Pacific Ocean. The sand was blindingly white. The sun was mercilessly bright, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore would have been peaceful if not for the constant shouting of instructors and the gasping, groaning sounds of men being pushed far beyond their physical limits. Marcus arrived on a Sunday afternoon and was processed in with the rest of Class 247. There were 182 men total, ranging in age from 18 to 35, coming from every branch of the military and every corner of the United States. Some were massive former football players who looked like they could crush bowling balls with their bare hands. Others were lean, wiry guys who moved with the fluid grace of natural athletes. A few were older, experienced military personnel who carried themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from years of service. And then there was Marcus, who looked like he'd wandered into the wrong place by mistake. The other candidates noticed him immediately, of course. It was hard not to. While they were comparing workout routines and sharing stories about their athletic achievements, Marcus sat quietly on his bunk, methodically organizing his gear and reviewing the training schedule they'd been given. "Hey, little man," called out a massive guy from Alabama named Jake Morrison, who claimed to have benched 350 pounds in college. "You sure you're in the right place? The math camp is probably down the road." A few other guys laughed, but it wasn't mean-spirited. These were men who respected effort and determination, and they hadn't seen Marcus in action yet. He was just an anomaly to them, something that didn't fit their expectations of what a SEAL candidate should look like. Marcus looked up from his gear and smiled politely. "I'm sure," he said simply, and went back to what he was doing. The first week of Bud/S was designed to weed out anyone who wasn't completely committed. The physical training was intense but manageable for men who had spent months preparing. The real challenge was mental, the constant pressure, the sleep deprivation, the instructors who seemed determined to find every weakness and exploit it mercilessly. Marcus struggled with some of the physical challenges, particularly those that favored size and brute strength. During log PT, where teams of 6 men had to carry, lift, and maneuver telephone poles weighing several hundred pounds, he often found himself as the weak link, unable to support as much weight as his larger teammates. During the obstacle course, his shorter stature made certain challenges significantly more difficult. While bigger, stronger men dropped out of the program, citing injuries or family emergencies, or simple acknowledgement that SEAL training wasn't for them, Marcus kept showing up. He might finish near the back of the pack during runs, but he finished. He might struggle during calisthenics, but he completed every repetition. He might be the last one over the obstacle course, but he made it over. The instructors noticed, of course. They noticed everything. Senior Chief Petty Officer Michael Hartley had been a SEAL for 15 years and a Bud/S instructor for 6. He'd seen thousands of candidates come through the program, and he'd developed an ability to predict within the first few days who would make it and who wouldn't. Size and strength mattered, but not as much as people thought. What mattered was something harder to define: mental toughness, stubbornness, the ability to keep functioning when your body was screaming at you to stop. Marcus Chen puzzled him. The kid was clearly struggling with many of the physical challenges, but he never complained, never made excuses, and never showed any sign of giving up. During particularly brutal training sessions, when even the strongest candidates were grimacing with exhaustion, Marcus would maintain the same calm, focused expression he'd worn on day one. "What do you think of the little guy?" Hartley asked his fellow instructor, Chief Petty Officer David Wright, during a break between training sessions. Wright, a massive former Marine who looked like he could wrestle bears for entertainment, shrugged. "He's tough, I'll give him that. But tough isn't enough. He's holding his team back during team events, and that's going to become a problem." Hartley nodded, but something nagged at him. He'd been watching Marcus carefully, and while the young man was clearly at a physical disadvantage during many exercises, he was also doing things that the other candidates weren't. During night training, when visibility was limited and mistakes were dangerous, Marcus never seemed lost or confused. During navigation exercises, he was consistently among the first to find his objectives. During academic sessions, he scored at the top of the class without seeming to study as hard as everyone else. It was as if Marcus had two completely different sets of abilities. In situations that required raw physical power, he struggled. But in situations that required precision, intelligence, and mental toughness, he excelled. The third week of training brought surf passage, one of the most dreaded exercises in Bud/S. Candidates had to carry their inflatable boats out through the surf, navigate around buoys in the open ocean, and return through the crashing waves without losing their boat or any of their teammates. The water was cold, the waves were massive, and the exercise was designed to simulate the kind of conditions SEALs might face during actual operations. Marcus's boat team consisted of himself and 5 other men, including Jake Morrison, the Alabama giant who'd made the crack about math camp on the first day. The team had struggled during previous exercises. Because of the size disparity, Marcus simply couldn't carry as much weight as the others, which meant they had to compensate for his limitations. "Look, Chen," Morrison said quietly as they prepared for the exercise. "No offense, man, but you're killing us here. Maybe you should think about whether this is really for you." Marcus looked at him steadily. "I'm not quitting, Jake. So we need to figure out how to make this work." Morrison sighed. "All right, little man. But if we fail this because you can't keep up..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood the implication. The team was losing patience with him, and he couldn't blame them. In a program where team performance mattered as much as individual achievement, being the weak link was a serious problem. The exercise began at dawn, with teams racing their boats into the surf. Marcus's team immediately fell behind as they struggled to coordinate their movements. The boat was heavy and unwieldy, and the waves were larger than any of them had experienced before. Within minutes, they were soaked, exhausted, and falling further behind the other teams. Then, about halfway through the exercise, everything went wrong. A massive wave caught their boat at exactly the wrong angle and flipped it completely over, dumping all 16 members into the churning water. In the chaos that followed, Marcus found himself separated from the others, struggling to stay afloat in water so turbulent that he couldn't tell which way was up. When he finally surfaced, gasping and disoriented, he realized that one of his teammates wasn't visible. Tommy Rodriguez, a quiet guy from Texas who'd been struggling with swimming throughout the program, was nowhere to be seen. The instructors in the safety boats had noticed too, and they were scanning the water frantically. But the waves were so large and chaotic that visibility was limited. Marcus could see the fear in their faces. They were about to lose a candidate. Without thinking, Marcus took the deepest breath of his life and dove back underwater. The water was murky and violent, with currents that seemed determined to drag him in every direction at once. Marcus fought against the chaos, using techniques he'd taught himself during those early morning training sessions in Oregon lakes. He'd always been a strong swimmer, not fast, but efficient and capable of staying underwater longer than most people expected. He found Rodriguez about 15 feet down, unconscious and sinking toward the bottom. The Texan was a big guy, at least 60 pounds heavier than Marcus, and dead weight in the water. Under normal circumstances, Marcus wouldn't have been able to move him. But these weren't normal circumstances. Marcus wrapped his arms around Rodriguez from behind and began kicking toward the surface, fighting against the weight of his teammate and the turbulence of the water. His lungs were burning, his muscles were screaming, and every instinct was telling him to let go and save himself. Instead, he kicked harder. The surface seemed impossibly far away. Marcus's vision was starting to tunnel, and he could feel his strength fading fast. Rodriguez was completely limp in his arms, and Marcus wasn't even sure if the man was still alive. Just when he thought he couldn't continue, Marcus felt hands grabbing him from above. The safety divers had finally reached them, and were pulling both men toward the surface. Marcus held on to Rodriguez until the very last second, only letting go when he was absolutely certain the safety team had him. They broke the surface together, and Marcus gasped for air, like a man who'd been buried alive. Rodriguez was unconscious but breathing, and the safety team immediately began working on him while Marcus floated nearby, too exhausted to do anything but tread water. "Jesus Christ, Chen," one of the safety divers said as they loaded Rodriguez onto a rescue board. "How the hell did you get down that deep? We could barely see you guys." Marcus didn't answer, because he honestly wasn't sure. He'd simply done what needed to be done, without thinking about whether it was possible or reasonable. When he saw his teammate in trouble, everything else had disappeared, except the need to help. Rodriguez recovered fully and returned to training. 2 days later, he never said much about the incident, but he started treating Marcus differently. So did the rest of their boat team. The quiet dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like respect. The instructors noticed the change too. During the next team exercise, Marcus's boat team worked together with a cohesion they'd never shown before. They weren't the fastest team, but they were efficient and coordinated. More importantly, they trusted each other completely. "That was interesting," Chief Wright commented to Senior Chief Hartley as they watched the teams complete their latest challenge. "Rodriguez's team is functioning better," Hartley agreed. "And it all changed after the surf passage. Think the little guy's got what it takes after all?" Hartley watched Marcus carefully as he worked with his teammates to secure their boat. The young man looked exactly the same as he had on day one. Small, quiet, unimposing. But there was something different in the way he carried himself now, something that suggested he'd discovered reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed. "I think," Hartley said slowly, "that we haven't seen what Marcus Chen is really capable of yet." He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The 4th week of Bud/S brought Hell Week, the legendary 5.5-day marathon that broke more candidates than any other part of the training. Sleep was limited to a few hours total over the entire period. Food was scarce. The physical challenges were relentless and designed to push men far beyond what they thought was humanly possible. Marcus approached Hell Week with the same quiet determination he'd shown throughout the program. But privately, he was terrified. He'd made it further than anyone had expected, including himself. But Hell Week was different. This was where the program separated those who merely wanted to be SEALs from those who would literally die before giving up. The week began on a Sunday evening with the traditional breakout, when instructors surrounded the candidates' barracks with machine guns loaded with blank ammunition and simulated an enemy attack. The candidates had to respond as if it were real, grabbing their gear and forming defensive positions while explosions went off around them, and instructors screamed orders through bullhorns. For the next 5.5 days, there would be no real rest, no comfort, and no mercy. Only the exercise of pure will against impossible circumstances. By Tuesday morning, more than 30 candidates had already rung the brass bell that signified their withdrawal from the program. The remaining men looked like extras from a zombie movie, hollow-eyed, stumbling, operating on nothing but stubborn refusal to quit. Marcus was in rough shape too, but he'd discovered something during those first few days of Hell Week. While the larger, stronger candidates were suffering from the constant physical punishment, he seemed to be handling the mental challenges better than most. When instructors screamed at him, he remained calm. When they piled on additional exercises, as punishment for some minor infraction, he simply did them without complaint. "You think this is funny, Chan?" Instructor Kowalski screamed in his face during a particularly brutal Wednesday morning session. The candidates had been doing burpees in the sand for 2 straight hours, and Kowalski had noticed that Marcus's expression hadn't changed from the same focused calm he always maintained. "No, Instructor Kowalski," Marcus replied evenly. "Then why aren't you suffering like everyone else? You think you're better than your teammates?" Marcus looked at the exhausted men around him, all of whom were gasping and grimacing with exhaustion. For a moment, he considered the question seriously. "No, Instructor Kowalski," he said finally. "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Kowalski stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if that was disrespect or simply honesty. Finally, he moved on to torment someone else, but Marcus could feel him watching for the rest of the session. That night, during one of their brief rest periods, Jake Morrison collapsed onto the sand next to Marcus. "How are you doing this, man?" he asked quietly. Morrison looked terrible dark circles under his eyes, sand embedded in every pore, hands shaking with exhaustion. "I'm twice your size and I feel like I'm dying." "You look like you could do this for another week." Marcus considered the question. The honest answer was that he felt like he was dying too. His body hurt in ways he hadn't known were possible, and he was so tired that he sometimes fell asleep while standing up. But there was something else, something he'd discovered about himself during those brutal days. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that I've been preparing for this my whole life without knowing it. Every time someone told me I was too small, every time someone looked right through me like I didn't matter, every time I had to prove myself all over again that was training for this." Morrison nodded weakly. "I get that, I guess. But this is different. This is about more than proving yourself. This is about surviving." "Yeah," Marcus agreed. "And I'm going to survive it. Because if I don't, then everyone who said I didn't belong here was right. And I can't let that happen." Morrison studied his face in the dim light. "You're not going to quit, are you? No matter what they do to us." "No," Marcus said simply. "I'm not going to quit." As it turned out, he wouldn't have to wait long to prove it. Thursday afternoon brought the exercise that would become legend among the men of Class 247. The candidates were already running on fumes, having had perhaps 6 hours of sleep total since Sunday. They were cold, wet, covered in sand, and operating on nothing but adrenaline and determination. The instructors announced that they would be doing a team exercise unlike anything they'd experienced before. Each boat team would have to carry their inflatable boat over an obstacle course that included climbing walls, crawling under barriers, and navigating through a maze of containers and structures. The catch was that they would be doing it blindfolded. One member of each team would be designated as the eyes, and would be allowed to see and give directions. The other 5 team members would be blindfolded and would have to trust their teammate completely to guide them through the course. For Marcus's team, the choice of who would serve as the eyes was obvious. Despite his physical limitations, he'd consistently demonstrated the best spatial awareness and navigation skills in the group. But there was a problem: the team with the eyes would also be carrying the heaviest load, because they wouldn't have use of their hands to help support the boat. "I can do it," Marcus said when Morrison expressed concern about the additional weight. "I know I can guide us through this." "That's not what I'm worried about," Morrison replied. "The question is whether you can carry your share while you're doing it. That boat's going to be heavy as hell, and if you can't keep up..." They all knew what would happen if they failed. More punishment, more exercises, more opportunities for the instructors to break them down. Marcus looked at his 5 teammates, all of whom were bigger and stronger than him, all of whom had been carrying extra weight throughout the program to compensate for his physical limitations. They were exhausted, demoralized, and running on empty. If they failed this exercise, it might be the thing that broke them completely. "Trust me," Marcus said quietly. "I won't let you down." They lined up at the starting line with the other teams. Marcus took a deep breath, adjusted his grip on the boat, and waited for the signal to begin. When the whistle blew, he discovered reserves of strength he hadn't known existed. The course was a nightmare of obstacles and confusion. While Marcus could see where they needed to go, he also had to help carry the boat and constantly communicate with his blindfolded teammates. The boat seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, and the obstacles were designed to be as difficult as possible. But Marcus had found something during those impossible days of Hell Week. He'd found the place inside himself where quitting simply wasn't an option, where pain was just information, where the only thing that mattered was the mission. "Left turn in 5 steps," he called out to his team as they approached a narrow gap between containers. "Morrison, duck your head." "Rodriguez, there's a rope hanging down on your right side." His voice was calm and clear, even though his lungs were burning and his muscles were screaming. The boat felt like it was getting heavier with every step, but Marcus kept moving, kept directing, kept pushing forward. They were falling behind the other teams. Marcus could see them pulling ahead, their progress steady and efficient. But he also noticed that some of those teams were starting to struggle with communication. Panic was setting in as the blindfolded team members became confused and disoriented. "Steady!" Marcus called to his team as they approached the most difficult part of the course, a series of climbing walls that they would have to navigate while carrying the boat. "We're going to take this slow and steady. Trust me, and trust each other." What happened next would be talked about among SEAL instructors for years to come. Marcus guided his team through the climbing sequence with precision that seemed almost supernatural. His directions were so clear and accurate that his blindfolded teammates moved with confidence, never hesitating, never second-guessing. The boat moved smoothly from obstacle to obstacle, and the team's pace actually began to increase. Meanwhile, other teams were struggling. The physical exhaustion combined with the sensory deprivation was proving too much. Men were stumbling, dropping the boat, arguing with their teammates. 2 teams had already given up and were doing penalty exercises on the side of the course. "How is the little guy's team doing that?" Instructor Wright asked Senior Chief Hartley as they watched Marcus's team navigate a particularly difficult section. Hartley didn't answer immediately. He was watching Marcus carefully, noting the way the young man seemed to have found an extra gear that nobody knew existed. The kid was carrying his full share of the boat's weight, maybe more, while simultaneously providing perfect navigation for his team. "I think," Hartley said finally, "we're about to find out what Marcus Chen is really made of." As they approached the final obstacle, Marcus could see that his team was actually in second place. The leading team was just ahead of them, but they were struggling with a complex section that required precise coordination. That's when disaster struck. Morrison, exhausted beyond measure, stumbled on an uneven piece of ground and lost his grip on the boat. The sudden shift in weight threw the entire team off balance, and for a moment, it looked like they were going to drop the boat completely. In that instant, with his team on the verge of failure, and his own body pushed far beyond its limits, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He grabbed the boat with both hands and lifted, not just his portion of the weight, all of it. For 9 seconds that seemed to last forever, Marcus Chen held that boat above his head by himself while his teammates regained their balance and their grips. 9 seconds during which a man who weighed 140 pounds carried a load that should have required 6 people. 9 seconds that defied everything the instructors thought they knew about human limitations. 9 seconds that even the SEALs didn't see coming. When his teammates had secured their hold on the boat again, Marcus lowered it back to the proper carrying position and continued guiding them toward the finish line as if nothing unusual had happened. They crossed the line in first place. The instructors stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The other candidates stared at Marcus with expressions of disbelief and newfound respect. And Marcus Chen, the quiet kid from Oregon who'd never looked like SEAL material, simply set down his end of the boat and waited for the next exercise, because he still had a promise to keep. The silence that followed Marcus's impossible feat lasted exactly 17 seconds. Senior Chief Hartley counted them, because in 15 years of SEAL training, he'd never experienced a moment when absolutely everyone on a training course stopped what they were doing to stare at a single candidate. Even the other teams that were still struggling through the obstacle course had paused their efforts to gawk at the small man who had just carried a 200-pound inflatable boat over his head like it weighed nothing at all. Did that just happen? Instructor Wright whispered to Hartley. I think so, Hartley replied, but his voice carried the uncertainty of a man who had just witnessed something that challenged his understanding of physical possibility. Marcus stood quietly beside the boat, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, but otherwise showing no sign of the superhuman effort he had just expended. His teammates were staring at him with expressions that mixed gratitude, amazement, and something approaching reverence. Chen! Hartley called out, his voice carrying across the training area, front and center. Marcus jogged over to where the senior chief was standing, his movements fluid and controlled, despite the fact that he should have been completely exhausted after what he'd just done. Explain to me what just happened back there, Hartley said. Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by the question. We were about to drop the boat, Senior Chief, so I made sure we didn't. Son, that boat weighs over 200 pounds. You held it over your head by yourself for nearly 10 seconds. How? Marcus considered the question seriously, as if he were trying to figure out the answer himself. I don't know, Senior Chief. It needed to be done, so I did it. Hartley studied the young man's face, looking for signs of bravado or false modesty. He found neither. Marcus genuinely seemed to think that what he'd done was simply what the situation required, nothing more remarkable than that. Have you ever done anything like that before? Wright asked. No, Chief, I've never had to. That answer sent a chill down Hartley's spine, because it implied something that he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. It suggested that Marcus Chen had reserves of capability that even he didn't fully understand, reserves that only emerged when they were absolutely necessary. Get back to your team, Hartley said finally. We'll finish debriefing after everyone completes the course. As Marcus jogged back to his teammates, Wright shook his head in disbelief. 15 years I've been doing this job, and I've never seen anything like that. Neither have I, Hartley admitted, and I'm not sure what it means. What it meant became clearer over the remaining day and a half of Hell Week. Word of Marcus's impossible lift spread through the remaining candidates like wildfire, and the story grew more impressive with each telling. Some claimed he'd held the boat for 30 seconds. Others swore they'd seen him lift it completely over his head with one hand. But more importantly than the stories was the effect Marcus's feat had on the other candidates. Men who had been on the verge of quitting suddenly found new reserves of determination. If the little guy from Oregon could do something that defied the laws of physics, then maybe they could dig deeper too. Maybe they all had untapped reserves of strength waiting to be discovered. Hell Week concluded on Friday evening with the traditional ceremony where the surviving candidates were awarded their brown T-shirts, signifying their completion of the most grueling phase of Bud/S training. Of the 182 men who had started Class 247, only 47 remained. Marcus Chen was one of them, but more than that, he had emerged as something unexpected, a legend. During the graduation ceremony, Senior Chief Hartley pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation. I need you to understand something, Chen Hartley said. What you did out there on Thursday, that's not normal. That's not something we see in training, and it's not something we can explain. Marcus nodded but remained quiet, waiting for the Senior Chief to continue. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Because if you can do something like that when your teammates need it, then you're not just going to be a SEAL. You're going to be something special. I just want to serve, Senior Chief, Marcus replied. I want to be part of a team that does important work. Hartley smiled for the first time since Marcus had known him. Son, I think you're going to get that chance. And I think your teammates are going to be very lucky to have you watching their backs. The remaining phases of Bud/S training passed in a blur of advanced combat techniques, diving operations, and land warfare exercises. Marcus continued to excel in areas that required mental toughness and precision, while gradually improving in the purely physical challenges as his body adapted to the constant demands of the program. But the real change was in how others saw him. The quiet dismissiveness of the early weeks was gone, replaced by genuine respect and curiosity. His teammates had learned to trust his judgment completely, and the instructors began using him as an example of what was possible when mental toughness overcame physical limitations. More importantly, Marcus had learned something about himself during those 9 seconds. He discovered that when everything was on the line, when people he cared about were counting on him, he was capable of things that seemed impossible. It wasn't about being stronger or faster than everyone else. It was about refusing to accept limitations when something truly mattered. 23 men from Class 247 ultimately graduated from Bud/S training and earned their SEAL tridents. Marcus Chen was one of them, but by then, he was no longer the overlooked small man who had arrived at Coronado months earlier. He was the guy who had held up a 200-pound boat with his bare hands when his team needed it most. He was the guy who had saved a drowning teammate during surf passage. He was the guy who had quietly, steadily, and without complaint proven that heart mattered more than size. After graduation, Marcus was assigned to SEAL Team 5, based in Coronado. His reputation had preceded him, and his new teammates welcomed him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Stories about the impossible lift during Hell Week had spread throughout the SEAL community, and everyone wanted to see if the legend was real. His first deployment took him to Afghanistan, where SEAL Team 5 was conducting counter-terrorism operations in some of the most dangerous regions of the country. Marcus thrived in the environment, using his intelligence and precision to excel at reconnaissance and tactical planning. He was never the biggest or strongest operator on the team, but he quickly became one of the most trusted. His teammates learned what his Bud/classmates had discovered. When Marcus Chen had your back, you could accomplish anything. 6 months into his deployment, Marcus found himself on a mission that would test everything he'd learned about himself during training. The team was tasked with rescuing 2 American journalists who had been captured by Taliban forces in a remote mountain village. Intelligence suggested the hostages were being held in a compound that was heavily fortified and surrounded by hostile terrain. The rescue operation would require a small team to infiltrate the compound, locate the hostages, and extract them without alerting the larger Taliban presence in the area. It was exactly the kind of mission that SEALs trained for, but it was also extremely dangerous, with very little margin for error. Marcus was selected for the infiltration team along with 3 other operators, all of whom were larger, more experienced, and more obviously suited for combat operations. But the team leader, a veteran chief petty officer named Anderson, had specifically requested Marcus for the mission. "I want the guy who can do impossible things when he has to," Anderson had told the mission commander. "Chen's got something the rest of us don't have, and I think we're going to need it." The infiltration went perfectly for the first hour. The team moved silently through the mountainous terrain, avoiding Taliban patrols and reaching their target location without detection. They located the building where the hostages were being held and confirmed that there were only 3 guards inside. But as they prepared to breach the building and rescue the journalists, everything went wrong. A Taliban patrol that wasn't supposed to be in the area appeared on the ridge above them, cutting off their planned extraction route. At the same time, additional guards emerged from buildings they hadn't known were occupied. Within seconds, the 4-man SEAL team found themselves surrounded by more than 20 Taliban fighters, with their mission only half complete. "We're compromised," Anderson whispered into his radio, requesting immediate support. The response was not what they wanted to hear. The nearest friendly forces were over an hour away, and air support was unavailable due to weather conditions. The team was on their own, surrounded by enemies, with 2 civilians still trapped in the compound. "Options?" Anderson asked quietly. The other team members exchanged grim looks. The tactical situation was hopeless. They were outnumbered 5-1, surrounded, and cut off from support. The smart move would be to abort the mission and try to escape before the Taliban forces closed in completely. But that would mean leaving the hostages to die. Marcus studied the compound and the surrounding terrain, his mind working with the same calm precision he'd shown during Bud/S training. He could see 3 possible courses of action, all of which were extremely dangerous. 2 of them had almost no chance of success. The third option was completely insane. "I have an idea," Marcus said quietly, "but you're not going to like it." He outlined his plan quickly, and the other team members stared at him with expressions of disbelief. "That's suicide, Chen," one of them whispered. "Maybe," Marcus admitted, "but it's also the only way to get those journalists out alive." Anderson studied Marcus's face, remembering the stories he'd heard about Hell Week. and the impossible boat lift. He'd served with Marcus for 6 months and had seen him accomplish things that seemed beyond his physical capabilities when the mission demanded it. "You sure about this?" Anderson asked. Marcus looked at the compound where 2 innocent people were waiting to die, then back at his teammates who were counting on him to find a solution to an impossible situation. "I'm sure," he said. What happened next would become part of SEAL legend, a story that would be told and retold for years to come. Marcus Chen, the quiet kid from Oregon who had never looked like warrior material, single-handedly changed the course of the battle with an act of courage and skill that even his teammates struggled to believe. Using a combination of stealth, precision shooting, and tactical brilliance, he systematically eliminated the Taliban positions that were preventing the team's escape. Moving like a ghost through terrain that offered almost no cover, he turned the hunters into the hunted, creating enough confusion and chaos to allow his teammates to complete the rescue and extract the hostages. The operation that should have ended in disaster became one of the most successful rescue missions of the entire Afghan campaign. Both journalists were recovered safely, and all 4 SEAL operators returned home without serious injury. But for Marcus, the real victory wasn't the successful mission or the commendations that followed. It was the moment during the firefight when he'd felt that familiar sensation of time slowing down, of discovering reserves of capability he hadn't known existed. Just like those 9 seconds during Hell Week, when everything had been on the line and failure hadn't been an option. Years later, when Marcus had completed multiple deployments and earned a reputation as one of the most effective operators in the SEAL community, people would still ask him about those legendary 9 seconds. How had he lifted that boat? What had made it possible? His answer never changed. When people you care about are counting on you, you find a way to do whatever needs to be done. It's not about being stronger or faster than everyone else. It's about refusing to accept that something is impossible when it matters most. Marcus Chen never did become the biggest or strongest SEAL in the teams, but he became something more valuable, the guy you wanted with you when everything went wrong and impossible was the only option left. He became the guy who proved that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who change everything, 9 seconds at a time, and in the end, that made all the difference not just for him, but for everyone whose life he touched along the way. The quiet kid from Oregon had found his calling, and in doing so, he'd shown the world that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it looks like what everyone expects, massive, obvious, and intimidating. And sometimes it looks like a 140-pound man holding up a 200-pound boat while his teammates find their balance, refusing to let them fall no matter what the cost. Either way, when it matters most, real strength always finds a way to rise to the occasion. Because that's what heroes do, even when nobody sees them coming.